Daniel Dwyer 6, July 3rd, 2023 AD. After all their years together, Dr. Foster knew that it was impossible to rouse Daniel. When Daniel spontaneously napped during the day, which was prone to happen at any time and during any activity, he would sleep the amount of time presumably prescribed by the 8-ball, and then suddenly wake and go about his day. He had a regular sleep schedule which he adhered to at night, but he was prone to bouts of sudden sleeping at any given time. It occurred roughly 2 to 3 times per day. So he didn't attempt to wake him when they'd arrived at his spacious, lonely house. He just left him asleep in the back seat, took his stuff inside, and returned with a shot glass and a bottle of whiskey in hand. With his free hand, he grabbed a lawn chair from his porch and dragged it to the driveway, placing it next to the car. Then he sat, poured, and downed a shot and looked up at the stars. "Where are you?" he said, addressing Daniel as if he was the thin air itself. The heat did not subside with the setting of the sun here, and Dr. Foster found no relief from it as the light faded, but in the wooded mountains west of the city of Dwyer, Las Vegas as it was known at the time, the air was cooling with the transition into the dark. So, when Ana Hernandez stepped out of the car with Justin and the other ill-fated boys, it was a little chilly for her taste. Justin's brother handed her a beer and kept her from tilting it down when she first took a swig, surprising her and prompting her to take another 2 before he let her lower it. The boys resounded with a cheer when a minute later she finished the first beer and they quickly switched it for a fresh one. She didn't drink this next one so fast. There was levity for all of 10 minutes, and she started to feel better and was laughing at all of their jokes and stories. Justin was feeling awkward, and was starting to regret having set his friend up the way he did, labeling her as a slut for use by his brother and his brother's friends. They had known one another for a few years, having gone to the same school for a while, and they had mutual friends from the neighborhood they grew up in. One wouldn't exactly say that they were close, but she was always around wearing her form-fitting, revealing clothes. They weren't besties or anything, but they knew each other well enough to have exchanged phone numbers at one point, so there was that. He started to loosen up though when the 19-year-old asked her if she'd ever had sex before, and she said no, but then asked her if she ever thought about having sex, and she said yes, and then asked her if she ever thought about having sex with Justin, and she said, "I don't know, maybe." He still didn't like the idea of sharing her, but he was totally down to fuck her. He was also still a virgin, but he made up stories which he clung to like glue about the time he'd had sex with a stranger who he'd met at a motel pool while vacationing with his family 2 years earlier. Now that he knew he had a chance for the real thing, he regretted having put her in this situation, preferring that they be alone. But if it must be a gangbang, then a gangbang it will be. She pulled her phone from her pocket for the first time since they'd picked her up, and no sooner had she unlocked it than the 19-year-old snatched it away, pretending to peruse through her stuff, all the while intent on keeping her from alerting anyone as to her whereabouts, because he didn't give a fuck. He was going to get his fuck on, come all over this little girl's face, fuck her in the ass, and then come all over her again. He was going to smear his dick all over her face so that she could taste the foulness of her own ass. Then he was going to shove it down her throat and come in her mouth, and if she didn't like it, it was all the better. He was already hard thinking about it and growing impatient. The 19-year-old was always the aggressor. The other 2 would join in like dogs in a pack once he got to going and needed help holding them down, but he was always the one who made it happen. They had done it several times before to several girls, none of them as young as Anna, but they didn't give a crap how old she was. She looked fuckable, therefore she was fuckable. That was actually what got the whole thing started, the announcement of her age. The 21-year-old was the only one of them who reacted with surprise, but knowing her age still wasn't enough to keep him from trying to rape her. He just found it shocking that such a well-developed girl could be so young. Things started to get out of hand when the 19-year-old said, "Bullshit, these aren't 11-year-old tits," and he put his hands up her shirt from behind and squeezed her breasts. He squeezed them hard, and it hurt when he squeezed them, and when she tried to push his hands away, he only squeezed harder and slid his body up close to her. She could feel his hard penis through their clothes, rubbing against her butt crack. She tried with more effort to push his hands away and said, "You're hurting me, stop." He only tightened his grip, digging his elbows into her sides and said, breathing right into her ear, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna hurt you, but it only hurts for a little while, and then it feels good, I promise." She started to really resist him now, pushing away from him and wriggling her body. The dogs reacted quickly and ferociously, each taking an arm and pinning her down to the ground face down. She started crying and wailing like she never had before as the 19-year-old angrily took her shorts down. Justin stood watching. At first he was appalled at what was happening, but then he became very aroused, and he ignored her cries for help as his boner swelled and he came in closer to observe. A rapist was born. When the 19-year-old put it in, she screamed, and when he started right in, pounding her hard from behind, she screamed even louder. He was hurting her very badly. The 21-year-old, feeling very nervous, looked around and said, "She's being too loud, knock her ass out." Justin's brother and the 21-year-old punched her in the back of the head repeatedly, but no matter how hard they hit her, she remained conscious and kept screaming. "She won't go down, man," Justin's brother said, trying again and again to hit her harder. Justin, adrenaline flying, excitedly positioned on his knees by Anna's head, grabbed a large rock from within arm's reach and raised it. He intended to knock her out, but there was a jagged edge aimed right for the point of contact, and she would have been dead had he struck the blow. Thankfully, he didn't get the chance. The black spirit of Daniel had appeared behind him and had consulted his 8-ball. None of them noticed him amid the commotion, but they saw him now. They saw him take control of Justin's arm and force the hand with the rock in it right up into his own face with such speed and force that the rock sat squarely where his brain had been. His face completely caved in, and his hand remained stuck in the surrounding bone and tissue, fingers bent backward against slices of skull, ulna and radius bones of the arm protruding like oversized toothpicks from his forearm that had nearly been completely severed from his elbow. The spirit stood over the little girl, who then quickly recoiled to the base of a nearby tree, pulling her shorts up, which immediately felt wet from the blood dripping out of her crotch. Justin's body crumpled to the ground as the scattered dogs backed away, watching the shadow look into the ball it held in his right hand. His movements were so fast they could scarcely be seen. Justin's brother was held in place with Daniel's hand at his throat. Then he caved his head in with the 8-ball in one swift downward thrust, collapsing it with no resistance. The 21-year-old met the same fate moments later. Anna watched with terrified amazement as her ghostly avenger dispatched justice. The 19-year-old had himself backed against a tree and had just finished getting his jeans pulled up and fastened. The black form moved so swiftly it was as if it had simply appeared in front of him. Daniel placed the 8-ball against his chest, pinning the 19-year-old to the tree. Then, in one swift movement, he grabbed the dog's shriveling dick through his jeans and tore it off along with the crotch of his pants, sending the severed penis flying with such speed that it stuck to a tree trunk where it flattened with a smack over 30 feet away. The 19-year-old howled in terrible pain, some of his lowermost organs slipping out through the gaping hole that had been left where his manhood used to be. The shadow leaned in until his face was right in front of the 19-year-old and switched hands, holding him in place by the throat now with his free hand, nearly severing his air supply. The 19-year-old's screams of pain very noticeably transitioned into screams of terror as it leaned closer to him. The spirit was not wholly the black of midnight. At such close proximity, the 19-year-old could discern what looked like the etching of a face on the black form, composed of very faint white lines veiled under purple dye. The dog would have pissed himself if his penis weren't 10 yards from him. Daniel stared at him a moment longer, letting the hopeless creature flail at his clutch, his desperate hands passing right through Daniel like he wasn't there at all. Then he flattened the rapist's head against the tree with a swift forward punch which not only sent pieces of his head flying in every direction, but split the tree bark so much so that his body remained anchored there, suspended by where a large splintering shard of the trunk had come through his neck. He didn't even turn around to look back at little Ana Hernandez, who was trying to calm herself and catch her breath, leaning back against her perch under the tree, shaking but no longer crying. She waved at Daniel, who stood with his back to her, and said, "Thank you." He didn't acknowledge her. He looked into his 8-ball and disappeared, fading into thin air like into a shadow. Then he was gone. After a much-needed moment to collect herself, she crawled over and picked up her phone from where it had been carelessly tossed. There was a crack across the face, but it still worked. much like how a part of her was now broken, but not so much that she would surrender to the idea that she was any lesser for it. She also still worked. She called her mother, who called the police, who triangulated the GPS signal on her phone and came to the scene. She had always considered herself streetwise, more so now than ever before for her experience, and she knew better than to tattle on a friend. So when they asked her if she'd ever seen anyone like this shadowy figure before, she lied and said no. But she knew damn well who it was. It was the strange man from the back seat of the car she'd seen on the highway, the one who she'd seen look into an 8-ball as they were passing. She wasn't going to snitch on him, though. So she only ever told her mother about it until 21 years later, when she was interviewed by Hannah Dunn and shared this last little bit of the story, having chosen to trust her. She told Hannah Dunn that she'd known all along that the spirit was a real, living, breathing person. She said she'd never told anybody about him because she didn't want him to get into trouble. Her description was instrumental in Hannah identifying Daniel Dwyer as the spirit, as the highway sighting corroborated with his known location at the time of the Ana Hernandez incident. This wouldn't be until she was 32 years old, and it would be the prelude to the death of Daniel Dwyer. If Anna had only known that her dark savior would not always be in control of his actions in the future, and was not to blame for the murder that for which she would later condemn him, and that her confession would lead to the identification and apprehension of Daniel Dwyer by the authorities, she would have kept her mouth shut. And if Hannah would have ever dreamed that Anna would betray him the way she did, she'd have kept her mouth shut too. At the time, she didn't see the harm in sharing his true name with Anna. History is riddled with pivotal moments often centered around ordinary people doing seemingly ordinary things. The 1st of October 2044 would prove to be one of those seemingly ordinary days, but the day that Hannah meets Anna would mark the beginning of the end for Daniel Dwyer. She was taken to the police station, and examiners gathered evidence of the rape from her body. After a few hours and more samples, she was allowed to go home and shower. Daniel was asleep in his new bed by then. He had awoken in the back of Dr. Foster's hot car, having returned from his dealings with the dogs, and been escorted in by the good doctor, who then shown him to his room. Dr. Foster had informed him that bedtime was 9:00 p.m. and showed him where he was sleeping. He showed him where to use the restroom and bathe, and where to eat. Daniel followed him where he was led, all the while looking regularly into his 8-ball, particularly at every junction. Every time that there was an effort made to communicate with him, he would look into the 8-ball, as though the 8-ball were translating what had been said. And every time he showed little to no indication that there had been any level of comprehension, except that he would follow simple instructions. This was an aspect of Daniel's personality all too familiar to Dr. Foster. The boy with the 8-ball had been very good at keeping a schedule and amazingly receptive to requests. Remarkably, this included waking at exactly the prescribed time every day without fail, with no need for an alarm clock. More amazing still is that one could inform Daniel that he was expected to wake an hour early, or 5 hours early, or 10 seconds later, and he would oblige every time. He adapted to life in Dr. Foster's home immediately. After all, he'd been living there for several years, for Daniel Dwyer was everyone, Dr. Foster included. As Daniel lay sleeping in the spare room, Dr. Foster took his bottle and a shot glass into his study and opened his laptop. He sipped a bit as he pulled up a website he'd been following. It was a site called Is the Shadow Man Real? None of the articles on the cover page had changed since the night before, but he suspected that would change in the days to come, as he believed another incident had just occurred. The articles he scrolled through were all about a mysterious avenger who had been described as a living silhouette and was allegedly responsible for no less than 11 deaths in the last few years since the site was started, and all supposedly during the intervention of an attempted murder, save one. One story stood out against the others. One man claimed that he had been saved from falling by the shadowy figure, caught in mid-air and placed safely on the ground after having fallen from his hotel window. He fell 16 stories only to land gently on his feet. He was one of the few who vividly described the coconut-shaped object in the shadow's hand, and he'd drawn a sketch of what the shadow looked like. The sketch was so well done that it served as the animation for the header on the website. The website was proudly managed by one Gabriel Noel Pascual, who himself claimed to have been saved by the shadowy figure some 2 years earlier. There was no new news, but Dr. Foster knew it wouldn't be long. As he poured one last shot, he said aloud to himself, "Come on, Daniel, where were you tonight?" Lyland 12.6, March 28, 2311 AD. Daniel Dwyer had outright stated that he was not a god. Still, he did not interfere when the people set out to construct houses of worship dedicated to him. He insisted only that the laborers be voluntary and the supplies donated. He forbade the collection of money from churchgoers and would actively intervene to subvert any attempt to sully his house or any related activities or what have you, which had been so often attempted in the beginning. The religions of old dwindled in popularity until they were all but extinguished, practiced by only a few small communities and an assortment of random naysayers throughout the world. For, though Daniel Dwyer offered no creation myth and did not pretend to have first-hand knowledge of any goings-on that for which he had none, he was nevertheless the savior of the people. He had eliminated governments on a global scale and alone carried the world into peace. Any attempt to stop him, of which there were many in the beginning, was met for the most part not by war and death, but by a peaceful dismantling. He would simply assume control of the bodies of those who were devising plots against him, after allowing them to devote their time and resources to whatever various plans they had constructed. Then he would take it all apart, leave them a message in their own handwriting and their known language, advising them that they had been thwarted and that their time and resources could have been better spent, and he would go on in his peaceful conquest of the earth. History records that he saved the lives of more than a few people who publicly bore him ill will regardless of their opinion of him, which so often changed in his favor once they'd been saved. Several were stopped from committing suicide. Those that he'd saved from their own hand were often even more inclined to sing his praise because of how they had been spared. Daniel did not personally dismantle the world's religions. All that he did was put an end to the corruption that was so deep-seated in the folds of their practice. When the wealthy and corrupt religious leaders of the world found that their bank accounts had been wiped out, along with those of the devious many who profited alongside them, with no hope of recovery through their normal manipulative means, they simply gave up. They knew they had been bested, and were now being stripped of that which they had obtained at the cost of their souls. They were being redeemed, but many did not see it that way. With the heinous tactics of garnering profit halted, the interest of those who had kept the fire aflame waned, and the institutions fell apart on their own. The Vatican itself was now considered a historical site and was frequented by more spectators than churchgoers. The deities of religions past could not compete with the God who saves indiscriminately and in plain view of the people. For in this time none die by any means that which he can prevent, nor do any know pain but by that which he could not foresee. Daniel sees through the eyes of everyone. He is everyone. His ability to know all of one's past gives him great predictive intuition when it comes to dangerous situations, and he sees more than any single one at once. In a room of 10 people, there are also then 10 of him, if not more. There could be more of his spirit transitioning the room, filling the room which one might never even see. He was everywhere. He was everyone. One of the great distinctions between Emma's way of knowing the world and Daniel's was that the past is concrete and unchanging, while the future is pliable and fluid. Daniel is everyone, and seeing the past knows them for who they are. Emma is also everyone, but seeing the future knows them for who they might become. She sees several pasts for the corresponding futures of all people on earth. She is privy to the effects minor changes can make on both household and global scales, and frequents the part of her mind where she gets lost playing out the possibilities. In other words, she daydreams often about her 8-day window into the future and frequently toys with how subtle, manageable changes send out ripples of consequence through the population. Though in doing so, she discovered a balance pervades. It seemed whenever she initiated a change that greatly benefited one individual or group of individuals or another, that she would do so to the detriment of another. Often, this consequence would fall outside of the parameters of her advanced knowledge of future history, and it would be too late for it to be undone by the time she could see the misery her actions would cause. No good deed goes unpunished, and for every person she tried to help by changing the future, it seemed another would invariably suffer. Up until the volcano, that is. As of yet, she had witnessed no reciprocation for having saved all of those people who would have otherwise perished. Were it not for her newfound knowledge of the mysterious circumstances surrounding the eruption, she would have been confident that if any resulting consequence should occur, it would not compare with having saved so many. The only thing that was different was that she was here. Had she not advised Daniel Dwyer of the pending eruption, she would not have been invited to undergo the blessing. It seemed to her like she was in the clear, like maybe nothing bad would happen as a result of her saving all of them after all. She bid Rosa take one more deep look into the eyes of the self-portrait of Hannah Dunn, centerpiece of He Saves, before they moved on to the next exhibit. Hannah Dunn was one of the most important people in modern history. It is such a shame that she died before she could reap the benefits of her posthumous fame. Were it not for her, Daniel may never even have known his own name. It was due largely to her obsession with him that upon his death in the year 2055 he was able to make the connection between what he had become and what he was in life. His spirit may never have known its own power had it not been for her knowledge of his power in life. She would die never knowing what the world would become, in part thanks to her. The next exhibit was all about the deconstruction period of the world's major religions and governments. The curator was very proud to point out that the handwritten note prominently on display in the glass case in front of them was an original artifact and not a reproduction. It was the note that had been posted to the door of the finance wing of the Vatican on the 1st of June 2061. It was the same phrase that had appeared on the doors of so many computerized vault rooms of religious institutions around the world that morning, translated into 56 languages. This one was in Italian, but they all said the same thing. The note read, "The coffers have been emptied into the pockets of the needy." And indeed, beyond what he allotted for the minimum foreseeable needs of those in the employ of such institutions, he had bankrupted them all. Many of the greedy who had benefited financially from their involvement attempted to steal the last crumbs and flee with them, but Daniel swiftly intervened. The money he'd left behind, he would explain, was to pay the people who worked for them, not to line the pockets of those who falsely believed that they were entitled to it. If hungry mouths did not depend on the trickle of money he'd left to be distributed, he'd likely have taken every last cent. Emma didn't need him to translate it. She'd seen it written in all 56 different iterations the world over. Again, she felt dismayed about her blindness. Here she was in the flesh, yet still not experiencing the museum any differently than she had before so many times, never seeing it through her own eyes. She squeezed Rosa's hand, who squeezed back, then locked eyes with her. "Are you okay?" Rosa asked, a little less of a smile across her face. Emma did not want to take away from the occasion, and she knew really that she had nothing to complain about, which wasn't so valid a complaint yesterday or the day before anyway. She was blind, and that was that. But she was so much more than that too, and knew that she had everything to be thankful for. She breathed a little sigh, looking yet again into the milky white of Emma Carter's blind eyes, her own eyes from the view of her friend, as she had done so many times before, and she said, "I am wonderful." Rosa seemed to beam all the brighter and jumped in place a tad. She was so excited and so happy. She had no idea that she was going to die today, nor did anyone else for that matter.